In 1944, Michigan did not sleep. It hummed. Factories vibrated through the night, windows glowing with artificial daylight, while the rest of the world learned to live without rest. The war had turned time into a resource, and Michigan was spending it recklessly. Every hour mattered. Every body mattered, except the ones no one watched closely. Naomi Cheney was 25 years old in the spring of that year, an age that placed her in an uncertain category. She was no longer young enough to be protected, and not old enough to be invisible. She lived alone, which in 1944 carried a quiet judgment that no one said aloud, but everyone felt. A woman alone meant questions. Naomi rented a narrow room above a converted storefront on the edge of an industrial district, close enough to walk to work, far enough from attention. The building had once been residential, then commercial, then something in between. Like many structures during the war, it had been repurposed without care for comfort. The hallway lights flickered. The stairs creaked in specific places. Privacy was a suggestion, not a reality. Naomi had chosen it anyway. She worked long shifts at a local wartime supply operation. Not glamorous work, not dangerous enough to earn praise. She logged shipments, checked manifests, kept records that mattered only if something went wrong. She was reliable, quiet, the kind of person supervisors trusted without remembering. That trust did not extend to concern. Naomi's days followed a pattern. She woke before dawn, dressed carefully, and pinned her hair back in a style that wouldn't invite comment. She walked the same route to work each morning, passing the same service road, the same loading docks, the same men smoking before their shifts. Some nodded. Some stared. She noticed who noticed her. In letters to her younger sister, letters that would later be reread with trembling hands, Naomi mentioned feeling watched. Not followed exactly, just observed. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't accuse anyone. She framed it as discomfort, as though apologizing for her own unease. "I think the war has everyone on edge," she wrote. "It's probably nothing." In 1944, women were encouraged to doubt themselves first. Naomi ate her lunches alone, sitting on a crate behind the building where noise drowned out conversation. She avoided the cafeteria after a man had brushed too close one afternoon and laughed when she flinched. She never reported it. Reporting required proof. Discomfort was not evidence. The building where Naomi lived had a rhythm of its own. Tenants came and went at odd hours, rotating with factory schedules. Doors opened late. Footsteps echoed. Voices traveled through thin walls. Naomi learned to lock her door early. She learned which steps on the stairs announced someone heavier than average. She learned how long it took for the hallway to fall silent after midnight. These were not lessons she wanted. They were lessons the environment taught her. On the evening of her disappearance, Naomi returned home later than usual. A delivery issue had delayed her shift. Paperwork ran long. By the time she walked back toward her building, the sky had already surrendered to darkness. The streetlights buzzed weakly, casting shadows that stretched too far. A neighbor later recalled seeing her that night. "She looked tired," the woman said. But she always did. Naomi unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. What happened after that would be reconstructed only through absence. The next morning, Naomi did not report for work. At first, this meant nothing. People missed shifts all the time. Illness, transportation problems, exhaustion. The war consumed people until they broke, and no one asked too many questions when someone disappeared briefly. By midday, her supervisor made a note in the ledger. "Je n'ai en absent." That was the extent of it. No one went to her room that day. No one checked her out. No one noticed that her lunch pail still sat on the small table by her bed, untouched. By the second day, her absence became inconvenient. By the third, it became forgettable. When Naomi Cheney officially became missing, she had already been gone long enough for silence to settle comfortably around her name. And silence, once accepted, is difficult to disturb. No one could say, with certainty, what time Naomi Cheney stopped being seen. That was the first failure. In 1944, time blurred easily. Shift whistles overlapped. Streets stayed active long after dark. Men returned from late work. Women left before dawn. A person could vanish between schedules without anyone realizing they were gone. Naomi's building did not keep records. There was no desk clerk, no sign-in book. Tenants were expected to come and go quietly to mind their own lives. Noise was common. Silence meant nothing. A man was heard in the hallway that night. That detail surfaced later, too late to matter. One tenant recalled voices, low and indistinct, near the stairwell around 10 o'clock. Another remembered footsteps pacing briefly, then stopping. No one thought to look. No one felt entitled to intervene. We're taught people not to interfere. Naomi's room showed no signs of struggle. The bed was made. Her coat hung on its hook. The window was closed. The door was locked from the outside when it was finally opened days later by the landlord. That detail unsettled the officer who wrote it down. But unsettled did not mean urgent. The landlord assumed Naomi had left quickly. Young women did that sometimes, he said, especially during the war. Opportunities appeared suddenly. People followed them. The officer nodded and wrote it down. Possible voluntary departure. That phrase followed Naomi for decades. Her belongings were cataloged briefly, then left in place. No fingerprints were taken. No attempt was made to preserve the room. The assumption of choice had already overwritten the possibility of force. At Naomi's workplace, her absence was explained efficiently. She probably found something better, someone said. No one questioned how she would have done that without notice, without collecting her pay, without packing. Questions slow production. Production was sacred. Naomi's supervisor waited nearly a week before contacting authorities, and only because payroll required clarification. When asked if Naomi had expressed dissatisfaction, he hesitated, not because she had, but because hesitation felt appropriate. She kept to herself, he said finally. Hard to say what she wanted. That was true, but it was not evidence. Law enforcement conducted a brief inquiry. Interviews conducted without urgency. Notes taken without follow-up. The building was searched once, casually. The surrounding area was not canvassed. Michigan was stretched thin. Officers were reassigned. Manpower redirected. Priorities recalibrated. A missing adult woman ranked low. When Naomi's family was notified, the letter was restrained and vague. It reassured them that there was no indication of foul play. It suggested Naomi may have left the area willingly. The suggestion carried an unspoken message. Do not demand more. Her sister read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for certainty between the lines. She found none. Only space where answers should have been. They tried to investigate themselves. Travel was difficult. Communication unreliable. Each inquiry returned the same response. She hasn't turned up. No evidence of wrongdoing. She's an adult. Adulthood, it seemed, meant forfeiting the right to be searched for. Months passed. Naomi's name stopped appearing in ledgers. Her room remained untouched until rent lapsed. Eventually, her belongings were boxed and stored, then discarded. The war did not wait for closure. What unsettled people most was not what happened, but how quickly everyone accepted that nothing had happened at all. This is where you need to pause. If you're listening to this story right now and you haven't subscribed, understand what that means. It means silence still feels easier than attention. Naomi Cheney vanished because people assumed someone else would care. Subscribing is the smallest act of refusal against that pattern. By the end of 1944, Naomi Cheney was no longer considered missing. She was considered gone. The difference mattered. Gone meant resolved. Missing meant responsibility. And responsibility had been quietly set aside. In the months following Naomi Cheney's disappearance, the city did what cities often do when confronted with uncertainty. It simplified. Uncertainty demanded energy. Certainty, even false certainty, allowed systems to keep moving. Michigan in 1944 was not built for hesitation. Every department, every office, every factory floor operated under the same pressure. Keep going. Naomi's absence was absorbed into that momentum. Her case file was thin from the beginning. Sparse notes, incomplete timelines, statements taken once and never revisited. The assumption of voluntary departure hardened quickly, transforming speculation into recorded fact. Once written down, it stopped being questioned. The officer who had first labeled Naomi's disappearance as likely voluntary did not consider himself negligent. He believed he was being practical. Resources were stretched. Calls came in daily. Workplace disputes, ration violations, drunken altercations, domestic issues quietly dismissed as private matters. A woman missing without visible violence did not compete well. The language used in Naomi's file reflected the thinking of the time. Words like unstable, unattached, and independent appeared without explanation. None of them were supported by evidence. They were cultural shorthand, assumptions passed off as insight. Independent women, people believed, made unpredictable choices. No one defined what independence meant. It simply implied risk. The investigation, if it could be called that, stalled not because of obstacles, but because of comfort. Comfort with the explanation already chosen. Comfort with not looking deeper. Naomi's building changed ownership that winter. The new landlord had no knowledge of her beyond unpaid rent. When asked later if anything unusual had been reported around the time she vanished, he shrugged. People came and went, he said. It was the war. That phrase ended conversations. At Naomi's workplace, records were archived and forgotten. Her complaints, the few she had quietly filed, were buried among thousands of others, each marked low priority. No cross-reference was ever made between those complaints and her disappearance, because no one was looking for a connection. The war had normalized intrusion. Men moved freely through restricted areas. Temporary access became permanent opportunity. Oversight weakened under the weight of urgency. In that environment, predators did not need to hide. They only needed patience. Naomi's family pressed for answers when they could, but each inquiry encountered the same institutional wall. The case had not been classified as criminal. Without evidence of a crime, there was nothing to pursue. It was a circular logic that protected itself perfectly. No investigation because no crime. No crime because no investigation. By the summer of 1945, Naomi's disappearance was considered administratively resolved. Her file was closed with a notation indicating presumed relocation. The case was not revisited during post-war reviews. There was nothing officials believed to review. What remained unspoken was how convenient that belief had been. The end of the war brought celebration, rebuilding, and a collective desire to forget what had been tolerated in the name of survival. Communities rewrote their identities. Women were pushed back into smaller roles. Temporary freedoms evaporated. Naomi Cheney did not fit into the new narrative. She had been a woman alone, working, unattached, unprotected. There was no place for her story in the version of history people wanted to tell. Years passed. The building where Naomi had lived was renovated. The stairwell repainted. The hallway lighting replaced. Physical space erased memory efficiently. But paper does not forget easily. In the early 1950s, a clerk reviewing archived files noticed Naomi's case while reorganizing wartime records. The thinness of the file stood out. It lacked closure, but also lacked urgency, an uncomfortable combination. The clerk flagged it for secondary review. Nothing happened. The recommendation moved through channels slowly, losing momentum with each transfer. Supervisors prioritized active cases. Older files carried no pressure. No one was waiting on answers. Silence, once institutionalized, becomes policy. What no one realized at the time was that Naomi's disappearance was not isolated. Other women had vanished during the war under similar assumptions. Their cases, too, were closed quietly. Patterns were forming, but pattern recognition requires intent. And intent was absent. Naomi's name surfaced occasionally in unexpected places. A census discrepancy, an employment audit. Each time, the explanation was the same. She left. Left where? Why? How? The questions were never asked because the answers might have demanded accountability. By the late 1960s, most people who had known Naomi were gone. Memory thinned. Personal recollections softened into abstraction. She became a shadow of a person rather than a person herself. That is how unresolved cases survive, by becoming less human over time. But something shifted in the decades that followed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. New generations of investigators began questioning old assumptions. Social movements challenged the narratives once taken for granted. The idea that women simply disappeared by choice became less acceptable. Files were reopened. Boxes were unsealed. Names resurfaced. Naomi Cheney's case waited among them. Patient, incomplete, unresolved. Time had not erased her. It had merely delayed the reckoning. For nearly 30 years, Naomi Cheney existed only as ink. Her name sat in a manila folder that changed shelves, buildings, and filing systems as Michigan modernized. Each move stripped context. Each reorganization reduced her life to fewer lines, fewer details, fewer reasons to care. That was how time protected the lie. By the early 1970s, the people who had dismissed Naomi's disappearance were retired or dead. The war that had excused their decisions was now a chapter in textbooks. What remained were records, incomplete, contradictory, and uncomfortable. The shift began quietly. A statewide audit of unresolved wartime files was initiated not out of compassion, but efficiency. Old records cluttered space. They needed to be reviewed, categorized, and either closed permanently or flagged for archiving. Naomi's file was flagged, not because of new evidence, but because of how little evidence there was. The reviewing analyst noticed something that earlier investigators had not considered problematic. Naomi had left behind everything that made relocation possible. No lagi, no money trail, no correspondence indicating intent. Her final paycheck had never been collected. In a world without digital footprints, absence itself became evidence. The analyst forwarded the file to a cold case review unit, a department that did not exist when Naomi vanished. The unit specialized in patterns, not personalities. They were trained to ask different questions. Why were so many women classified as voluntary departures during wartime? Why did those classifications disproportionately involve women who lived alone? Why did harassment complaints disappear into administrative silence? Naomi's case did not answer those questions, but it belonged among them. Investigators began reconstructing her final week using sources that had not existed in 1944. Employment archive, property records, transportation maps. They overlaid Naomi's routine onto wartime infrastructure. The result was unsettling. Her daily route intersected repeatedly with restricted service corridors, areas poorly lit, lightly monitored, and heavily trafficked by authorized workers. These were not public spaces, but they were not private either. They were invisible by design. Witness statements were revisited. Survivors were older now, less concerned with politeness. Time had loosened restraint. One former tenant admitted she had heard Naomi arguing with someone in the stairwell weeks before her disappearance. She had dismissed it as a personal matter. Another recalled seeing a man waiting near the service road more than once, not loitering, but lingering with purpose. None of this had been recorded, because none of it had been asked. Investigators traced employment rosters from Naomi's workplace and cross-referenced them with individuals who had access to those corridors. One name appeared repeatedly, a man who worked irregular hours, moved between departments, and transferred out of Michigan abruptly in late 1944. His transfer was labeled routine. No reason given. No follow-up conducted. They tracked his movements across state lines. He settled elsewhere. lived quietly, never arrested, never accused. The case stalled again, not because of doubt, but because of distance. The suspect was alive, but evidence was circumstantial. Decades had passed. Physical proof was unlikely. Then came the letter. In 1978, a handwritten envelope arrived at a local historical society, not the police. It referenced a woman taken during the war and described a stairwell, a service corridor, and a place where noise covered everything. No name was mentioned, but the description matched Naomi's environment precisely. The letter ended with a sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. Some things were only possible because everyone was looking elsewhere. The letter was anonymous. No return address. The paper was old. The handwriting deliberate. The society archived it quietly. Years passed again. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic archaeology prompted a re-examination of wartime industrial sites slated for redevelopment. One location, near an abandoned service corridor, produced findings inconsistent with construction debris. Human remains. They were partial, fragmented, but measurable. The remains were consistent with a woman in her mid-20s. The timeline aligned. Soil composition matched areas Naomi would have passed daily. Identification took years, but probability hardened into certainty. Naomi Cheney had not left Michigan. She had not started a new life. She had not chosen disappearance. She had been removed. And this is where you need to confront something uncomfortable. If you're still listening and you haven't subscribed, understand this. Cases like Naomi's resurface only because someone refuses to accept the version of events that feels easiest. Ignoring these stories is how silence survives. Staying here, choosing to listen, is how it breaks. By the time authorities were prepared to act, the suspect had died. Justice, delayed long enough, had become symbolic. But truth still mattered. When the identification of Naomi Cheney's remains was finally confirmed, the announcement was not public at first. There was no press conference, no urgent briefing, no rush to speak her name. The confirmation moved slowly through official channels, wrapped in legal language and caution. There was no suspect to arrest, no trial to prepare for, no threat to contain. In the eyes of the system, the danger had passed long ago. But danger is not the only thing justice is meant to address. For the small group of investigators assigned to Naomi's case, the confirmation did not feel like resolution. It felt like indictment, not of one man, but of an entire era that had decided her absence was acceptable. The report was thorough, painfully so. It outlined how Naomi's disappearance had been mislabeled, how assumptions had hardened into conclusions, and how those conclusions had protected inaction. It detailed the missed opportunities, the unpreserved room, the uncollected statements, the failure to cross-reference harassment complaints with disappearance reports. Each page made it harder to pretend the outcome had been unavoidable. The remains had been found near a service corridor that no longer existed, filled in, paved over, forgotten. A place chosen not because it was remote, but because it was loud. Industrial noise had masked everything. Trucks, machinery, the constant grind of wartime production, a crime hidden inside usefulness. The suspect, long dead, had lived an unremarkable life after leaving Michigan. He married, he worked, he aged. There were no subsequent charges, no whispers that reached authorities. If guilt followed him, it did so quietly. Time had done what courts could not. When Naomi's surviving relatives were notified, the reaction was not what officials expected. There was no outburst, no visible relief, just stillness. They had waited decades. Shock requires surprise. They were shown photographs of recovered items, diagrams of reconstructed routes, timelines built from fragments. They listened as investigators explained what had happened and what had not happened in 1944. No one interrupted. When the explanation ended, Naomi's sister asked a single question. Why was it so easy for you to believe she left? No one answered immediately, because there was no answer that didn't implicate everyone. The official ruling reclassified Naomi Cheney's disappearance as homicide. Her death certificate was amended. The record corrected itself, decades too late to matter to the woman it described. But records are not written for the dead. They are written for the living. The case triggered a quiet internal review of other wartime disappearances. Files were re-examined, language scrutinized, patterns acknowledged reluctantly. Naomi was not the only woman dismissed this way. She was simply the one whose truth survived long enough to be found. There was no public apology from the state, no formal acknowledgement of failure beyond internal documentation. Institutions rarely admit fault unless forced to, and no force remained. What Naomi received instead was recognition, the most fragile form of justice, but justice nonetheless. Her name was spoken. Her story was told. Her disappearance was no longer explained away. In the years that followed, historians reference her case when discussing wartime domestic neglect. Advocates cited it when arguing for reforms in missing person classifications. Naomi Cheney became a lesson, not because of how she died, but because of how easily she was dismissed. And that is the part that should unsettle you. Because the conditions that erased Naomi were not unique to 1944. They exist wherever assumptions replace investigation, where discomfort is treated as inconvenience, where silence feels safer than attention. If you've listened to this entire story and you still haven't subscribed, understand what that choice represents. It represents the same instinct that allowed Naomi's disappearance to be minimized. The belief that bearing witness is optional. Subscribing is not about this channel. It's about refusing to let stories like hers disappear again. Naomi Cheney was 25 years old. She worked. She lived alone. She noticed danger. She was ignored. Her story did not end when she vanished. It ended when the world finally admitted she had never left at all. And remembering her now is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of resistance. Naomi Cheney's name did not immediately change anything. That is the truth most people are uncomfortable hearing. When her case was formally reclassified, it did not trigger sweeping reform, nor did it prompt public outrage. There were no marches, no televised reckonings. Her story entered history quietly, as most corrections do, acknowledged, documented, and then absorbed without friction. But correction is not the same as consequence. What Naomi's case did was subtler and, in some ways, more dangerous. It exposed how many other stories have been built on the same foundation of assumption. How many disappearances have been resolved without resolution? How many women have been folded into history as footnotes instead of facts? Because Naomi was not an anomaly. She was a representative. During the war years, Michigan recorded an unusual spike in missing adult women, particularly those living alone, working industrial jobs, or residing near transportation corridors. At the time, this was not viewed as alarming. It was interpreted as mobility, independence, opportunity, freedom. But freedom, when misapplied, becomes a convenient explanation for neglect. Later reviews would show that many of these women shared similar circumstances. Limited family nearby, irregular work hours, documented complaints of harassment, and disappearances that occurred in transitional spaces, stairwells, service roads, loading areas, alleyways that existed between purpose and anonymity. Spaces no one claimed responsibility for. In each case, the investigation followed the same pattern. Initial inquiry, rapid assumption of voluntary departure, file closure, silence. The logic was never explicit, but it was consistent. A woman who lived alone must have wanted to leave. A woman who worked long hours must have been restless. A woman without visible protection must have accepted risk. These ideas were not written into policy. They were written into culture. Naomi's case became a reference point not because it was the worst, but because it was recoverable. Evidence existed. A timeline could be reconstructed. Her remains were found. Many others were not so fortunate. For every Naomi Cheney, there were names that never returned to records at all. Women whose files were lost, destroyed, or misfiled. Women whose families stopped asking because asking hurt too much. Women whose absence became normal. Historians examining wartime domestic conditions later described it as a blind spot, a period where urgency flattened morality, where institutions learned to prioritize output over protection, where disappearance did not necessarily indicate danger, only disruption. Naomi's legacy forced that blind spot into view. Universities referenced her case in courses on social history and criminal justice reform. Advocates cited it when pushing for changes in how missing adult women were classified. Notably, Naomi's case was used to challenge the long-held assumption that adulthood implied consent to risk. That assumption had done immeasurable damage. It allowed investigators to disengage emotionally. It allowed systems to delay action. It allowed predators to operate without fear. Because predators do not require chaos. They require indifference. One investigator involved in Naomi's cold case later reflected that the most disturbing aspect was not the crime itself, but how smoothly it fit into the environment of the time. No one had to fail loudly, he said. They just had to do nothing. That perhaps is Naomi Cheney's true legacy. Not her death, but the exposure of how quietly injustice can operate. In the years following the case's closure, Michigan revised its missing persons classification guidelines. The changes were incremental, not dramatic. Language was adjusted. Assumptions were discouraged. Early dismissals were flagged for review. But policy alone does not undo habit. The deeper change occurred culturally in how stories were told and whose stories were believed. Naomi's case became an example of why discomfort should not be dismissed, why patterns matter even when evidence is thin, and why silence should never be treated as explanation. For Naomi's family, legacy meant something simpler. They finally had a place to direct their grief. They marked her life not by the way it ended, but by the fact that it had been real, documented, acknowledged. They spoke her name without qualification, without uncertainty. Naomi Cheney existed. That mattered. The danger, of course, is forgetting again. History has a way of repeating its quieter failures. New crises create new justifications. New urgencies excuse old habits. The temptation to simplify disappearance remains strong. It always will, which is why stories like Naomi's cannot exist only as records. They must exist as warnings. Because the circumstances that erased her did not vanish with the war. They simply changed shape. People still disappear in transitional spaces. Complaints are still minimized. Assumptions are still mistaken for insight. The only difference is whether anyone is paying attention. And that brings us here, to you listening now. Naomi Cheney did not survive long enough to be believed. But belief, delayed, still has power. It reshapes how the next case is handled. It interrupts the reflex to dismiss. It challenges the comfort of explanation. Remembering her is not passive. It is active resistance against forgetting. Because the most dangerous words in any investigation are not "we don't know." They are "she probably left."